She only needed $40 to keep her baby fed, but that night, one wrong digit sent her message to a man who had forgotten what it meant to care. The rain tapped softly against the narrow window of Emily Carter's small apartment, a steady rhythm that filled the silence between her daughter's fragile breaths, and in the dim yellow glow of a single lamp. Emily sat on the edge of a worn couch, her blonde hair loosely tied, strands falling across her tired face as she stared at the nearly empty tin of baby formula on the table, turning it slowly in her hands as if hoping it might somehow refill itself, her fingers trembling not from cold but from the weight of a choice she didn't want to make, because asking for help had never come easily to her, not since the day she realized she would be raising her child alone, not since pride became the only thing she still felt she owned. But pride didn't feed a hungry baby, and pride didn't stop the quiet whimper coming from the crib beside her, so she reached for her phone, hesitating just long enough to feel the sting of shame before opening her messages and typing a name she hadn't called. In weeks, her older brother, the last person she could still ask without feeling like she was breaking completely, her thumbs hovering over the screen before finally moving, slow and careful, as if each word carried more weight than it should. Hey, I'm really sorry to ask again, but could you send me $40? I just need to get formula for Lily. I'll pay you back Friday, I promise. She read it twice, then a third time, adjusting nothing, because there was nothing left to soften, and with a quiet exhale, she pressed send, the small whoosh sound echoing louder than it should have in the stillness of the room. And for a moment, she just sat there, staring at the screen as if waiting could somehow change what had already been done. But across the city, far above the rain-soaked streets, Daniel Hayes stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling window in his penthouse office, the skyline glowing beneath him in sharp lines of light and glass, his reflection barely visible against the city as he loosened his tie with one hand, the other holding a glass of untouched water, his mind still tangled in numbers, contracts, decisions that moved millions of dollars without ever touching a real life. And when his phone buzzed on the desk behind him, he almost ignored it, assuming it was another update, another demand, another reminder of the world he controlled so effortlessly. But something made him turn, something small and unexplainable. And when he picked it up and saw the message, his brow furrowed slightly, not in irritation but in confusion, because the words didn't belong to his world. They were too raw, too simple, too real, and for a second, he considered deleting it without a thought. Just another wrong number, another mistake in a system that usually ran with precision. But his thumb hovered over the screen, paused by a single phrase that didn't fit into his usual calculations: baby formula. And something about it lingered longer than it should have, like a memory he couldn't quite place. So instead of deleting it, he typed back, his response short, almost automatic: I think you have the wrong number. And he set the phone down as if that ended it. As if he had done what was expected. But in the small apartment across town, Emily's phone lit up almost instantly, the reply cutting through her fragile hope before it had time to settle, her stomach dropping as she read the message, her cheeks burning even though no one could see her. And she quickly opened the contact, her heart sinking as she noticed the single wrong digit that had changed everything, her breath catching as embarrassment rushed in, stronger than the fear had been moments before, and she typed quickly, fingers clumsy now. I'm so sorry. I must have typed the wrong number. Please ignore that. She sent it and placed the phone face down beside her, pressing her lips together as if she could hold back the emotion building behind her eyes. Because this was exactly why she hated asking. Because even when no one said anything cruel, the silence that followed felt just as heavy. But then, a few seconds later, the phone buzzed again, and she hesitated before turning it over, her eyes scanning the new message slowly, unsure what she expected to see. Is your baby going to be okay? And for a moment, she just stared at the words, confusion replacing embarrassment, because strangers didn't ask that. Not anymore. Not in a world where everyone had something to gain. And she almost didn't reply, almost chose to let the conversation end there, safe and distant. But exhaustion had a way of lowering defenses, of making even the smallest kindness feel like something worth risking. So she typed back, carefully this time. She'll be okay. I'll figure something out. Her response brief, guarded, but honest. And on the other side of the city, Daniel read her message, his jaw tightening slightly as he looked out over the glowing skyline again. But this time, the view didn't feel the same. The lights didn't feel as distant, and without fully understanding why, he picked up his phone again, his fingers moving before his thoughts could catch up. What formula does she need? And somewhere between the rain tapping against a small apartment window and the quiet hum of a city that never stopped moving, a mistake that should have ended in silence was beginning to turn into something neither of them had planned, something small, fragile, and quietly powerful, like the first breath of something that might change everything. Emily stared at the message for a long moment, her fingers hovering over the screen as if the wrong reply could somehow close a door she did not even understand had opened, and the soft sound of Lily shifting in the crib pulled her attention back to the present, grounding her in the quiet urgency of the moment. Because no matter who this stranger was, no matter how unusual the question felt, the truth remained simple and heavy in her chest. Her baby needed to eat, and pride had already cost her too much time. So she typed slowly, choosing honesty over caution. It is called Comfort Care Gentle Formula. It is the only one that does not upset her stomach. And she hesitated before adding, but it is expensive. I will manage somehow. Then she pressed send before she could reconsider, her breath catching slightly as she set the phone down beside her again, her eyes drifting to the small crib where Lily lay, her tiny chest rising and falling in uneven rhythm, a quiet reminder of everything that mattered. And for a few seconds, nothing happened, the room returning to its familiar stillness, the rain continuing its soft tapping against the glass. But then her phone buzzed again, and this time the sound felt louder, sharper, as if it carried something she could not yet name. And when she picked it up, her heart skipped, because instead of a message, it was a notification from her bank, and she frowned slightly, confused, before opening it, her eyes scanning the numbers once, then again, and again, as if repetition might make more sense of what she was seeing. Because the amount was not $40, it was not even close, it was $400, transferred instantly into her account. And for a moment, she could not breathe, her mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. Her first instinct was disbelief, followed quickly by a surge of panic, because nothing in her life came without strings, nothing arrived without expectation, and her fingers moved quickly, almost frantically, opening the message thread again. This is too much. I cannot accept this. Please take it back, she typed, her pulse quickening as she hit send, the words barely containing the mix of gratitude and fear rising inside her. And across the city, Daniel sat at his desk now, the skyline behind him fading into the background as he watched the small typing bubble appear on his screen, his expression unreadable but his attention fully captured. And when her message came through, he read it once, then leaned back slightly in his chair, exhaling through his nose as if he had expected this reaction, because part of him understood it, understood the hesitation, the instinct to refuse help that seemed too generous to be safe. And without overthinking it, he replied, consider it advance help. No need to return it. Just make sure your baby is taken care of. And he paused for a moment before adding, everyone needs help sometimes. His thumb hovering briefly before he sent the message, and something about those words lingered with him longer than he anticipated, because they did not feel like something he would normally say. Not anymore. Not after years of building a life that required distance, control, precision. But as he placed his phone down again, he found himself not returning immediately to his work, his thoughts drifting instead to the image forming in his mind, a young woman in a small apartment, counting coins, choosing between dignity and survival. And the quiet weight of that image unsettled him in a way he could not quite explain. While back in her apartment, Emily read his message slowly, her eyes softening as the tension in her shoulders eased just slightly, because there was no pressure in his words, no expectation hidden beneath them, just a simple statement that felt almost unfamiliar in its sincerity. And she glanced at the crib again, her throat tightening as relief finally began to replace fear, her mind already calculating what she could buy, how long this would last, how many days of worry it might remove. And for the first time in what felt like weeks, she allowed herself to breathe fully, her fingers moving more gently now as she typed, thank you. I do not know how to express how much this helps. And she paused, then added, "I will make sure she is okay," before sending it, her grip on the phone loosening slightly, as if something inside her had shifted, something small but meaningful, and for a moment, she considered leaving it there, letting this unexpected kindness remain a brief moment in an otherwise difficult night. But then her eyes narrowed slightly as a thought surfaced, something subtle but unsettling, because there was one detail that did not quite fit, one thing she had not noticed at first, and she scrolled back through the messages slowly, her heart beginning to beat a little faster, because she had never mentioned her daughter's name, not once, not in any of the messages she had sent, and yet, the way he had written, the way he had said, "your baby," with such certainty, it lingered in her mind differently now, and as she stared at the screen, a faint unease mixed with her gratitude, not enough to erase it, but enough to make her question, who exactly was this man on the other end of the phone, and why did it feel like he already knew more about her life than he should? While across the city, Daniel picked up his phone again, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to check if she had replied, a small action that felt oddly unfamiliar, and as he read her message, his gaze softened just slightly, a quiet shift in a man who had spent years avoiding emotional entanglements, and without fully realizing it, he found himself typing again, "Get some rest if you can. It sounds like you have had a long day," and as he sent it, he leaned back once more, his eyes drifting to the city lights. But this time, they did not feel as distant, because somewhere out there, a stranger's life had intersected with his in the simplest way possible, and yet, it was already beginning to change something inside him, something he had not felt in a very long time, something that could not be measured in numbers or controlled by strategy, something quiet, human, and unexpectedly real. The rain had softened into a quiet drizzle by the time Emily wrapped Lily in a thin blanket and stepped out into the cool night air, the streetlights casting long reflections on the damp pavement as she held her daughter close against her chest, her mind still replaying the message and the number she could not stop thinking about. For $100, it felt unreal even now, like something that belonged to someone else's life, not hers. And yet the warmth of Lily's small body against her reminded her that this was real, that tonight she could walk into a store without calculating every cent in her head, without choosing the cheaper option that made her baby uncomfortable, and that thought alone made her steps a little steadier as she moved toward the small convenience store 2 blocks away. The familiar hum of fluorescent lights greeting her as she pushed the door open, the bell above chiming softly, and for the first time in weeks, she did not feel the weight of every eye on her as she walked down the narrow aisle toward the shelf of baby products, her fingers brushing lightly over the tins until she found the one she needed, Comfort Care Gentle Formula, and she paused for a moment, staring at it as if it might disappear, her reflection faintly visible on the metal surface, tired but hopeful in a way she had almost forgotten how to feel, and as she placed 2 tins into her basket instead of one, a small decision that felt surprisingly significant, her chest tightened with something unfamiliar, relief, maybe even the beginning of something softer, something like trust. But as she approached the counter and set the items down, her phone buzzed again in her pocket, and the sound pulled her back into that quiet uncertainty that had not fully left her, because kindness from a stranger did not erase the questions that followed. And while the cashier scanned the items with a polite smile, Emily slipped her phone out and glanced at the screen, her heart skipping slightly when she saw another message from the unknown number. "Did you manage to get what you needed?" And she hesitated before replying, her fingers moving more slowly now, more carefully. "Yes. I am at the store right now. Thank you again." She sent the message and looked up just in time to see the total appear on the register. And for once, she did not feel that familiar wave of dread. She simply reached into her bag and paid without hesitation, the transaction quick and effortless in a way that felt almost foreign. And as she stepped back out into the night, the cool air brushing against her face, she let out a breath she had not realized she had been holding, her grip on the bag firm, but her shoulders lighter than they had been in days. And across the city, Daniel sat in the quiet of his office, the usual noise of late-night work absent as most of the building had already emptied, his phone resting in his hand as he read her reply. And for a moment, he allowed himself to picture the scene, a small store, fluorescent lights, a tired mother finally able to buy what her child needed without hesitation. and the image lingered longer than it should have, pulling his attention away from everything else. And without fully thinking it through, he typed again, "That is good to hear. Make sure you get enough for a few days." And as he sent the message, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting once more to the city beyond the glass. But this time, his mind was not on the deals waiting for his approval or the meetings scheduled for the morning. It was on a stranger he had never met, and the quiet impact of a decision that had taken him less than a minute to make. And back on the street, Emily read his message as she walked, her steps slowing slightly as she processed the words. Because there was something in the way he spoke that did not feel distant, did not feel transactional. It felt present, attentive in a way that made her both grateful and cautious at the same time. And she adjusted Lily gently in her arms before replying, "I will. This will help more than you know." And she hesitated before adding, "You did not have to do this." And when she sent it, she found herself staring at the screen a moment longer than necessary, as if expecting something more, something that might explain why a stranger would go this far. But instead, what came back was simple, almost understated, "Maybe I did." And the words stayed with her as she continued walking, her mind turning them over quietly, because they did not sound like someone trying to impress or control. They sounded like someone who believed them. And that made her pause just outside her building, the dim light above the entrance flickering slightly as she stood there, looking down at her phone, her thoughts shifting again to that small detail she could not quite ignore, the way he had asked about her baby with such certainty, the way his tone carried a familiarity that had not been earned yet. And as she stepped inside and made her way up the narrow staircase, each step echoing softly in the quiet hallway, she felt that mix of comfort and curiosity growing stronger. And by the time she reached her door and pushed it open, setting the bag down on the small table, she knew she could not ignore it any longer. And after settling Lily back into her crib and watching her tiny face relax as sleep returned, Emily picked up her phone again. Her fingers steady now, but her heart beating just a little faster as she typed a message that felt more direct than anything she had said so far. "Can I ask you something?" And she paused, then continued before she could change her mind. "How did you know I have a baby?" And as she stared at the screen, waiting, the quiet of the room seemed to deepen around her, the rain now barely audible against the window. And for the first time since this unexpected connection had begun, she was not just receiving help, she was seeking truth, even if she was not entirely sure she was ready for the answer. Daniel stared at the message longer than he expected to, his phone resting loosely in his hand as the quiet hum of the office seemed to fade into the background. Because her question was simple, direct, and entirely reasonable, and yet it landed with a weight he had not anticipated, forcing him to confront something he had not fully acknowledged even to himself. And for a moment, he considered giving a vague answer, something safe that would close the gap without revealing too much. But the truth was already there, sitting between the lines of everything he had said, and he knew that if he answered carelessly now, whatever fragile trust had begun to form would disappear just as quickly as it had appeared. So he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk, his gaze dropping to the screen as he began to type, then stopped, deleting the words before they were even complete, because they did not feel right. They felt distant, calculated, and that was not what this moment required, not if he was going to continue this conversation honestly. And after a brief pause, he typed again, slower this time, more deliberate. "You mentioned formula. Most people do not ask for that unless it is for a baby." He read the message once, knowing it was only part of the truth, but enough to explain without crossing a line he was not ready to define. And he pressed send, setting the phone down gently, as if the action itself carried more meaning than it should. While across the city, Emily watched the screen intently, her fingers lightly gripping the edge of the phone as she waited, the silence stretching just long enough to make her wonder if she had asked too much, if perhaps she had pushed beyond what a stranger was willing to explain. But when the reply finally appeared, her eyes moved quickly across the words, her expression softening slightly as the tension in her chest eased, because the answer made sense. It was logical, grounded in observation rather than something more unsettling. And yet, as she read it again, she could not ignore the subtle detail beneath it, the attentiveness it implied, the fact that he had not dismissed her message earlier, that he had read it carefully enough to notice what others might overlook, and that realization brought a quiet shift in her perception, because this was not just someone who had sent money and moved on. This was someone who had chosen to stay present, even if only through a few lines of text, and she found herself replying without overthinking it this time. "That makes sense," followed by a brief pause before she added, "Most people would not have noticed." And when she sent the message, she leaned back slightly against the couch, her gaze drifting toward Lily's crib, where her daughter now slept peacefully. Her small face relaxed in a way that brought Emily a sense of calm she had not felt in days. And for a moment, the room felt different, not because anything had physically changed, but because the pressure that had been sitting on her shoulders had lifted just enough to let her breathe. And as she watched Lily, her thoughts shifted again, not to the struggle of tomorrow or the bills waiting at the end of the week, but to the man on the other end of the phone, a stranger who had stepped into her life for no reason she could fully understand. And the more she thought about it, the more unusual it felt, not in a threatening way, but in a way that made her question what had led him to respond at all, because kindness like that was rare, especially without context. And before she could stop herself, she picked up her phone again, her fingers moving with a quiet curiosity that had begun to replace her earlier hesitation. "Can I ask something else?" she typed, then continued without waiting for permission. "Why did you help me?" And as she sent the message, she felt a small flicker of uncertainty return, not fear, but the awareness that this question might carry more weight than the last, because it was no longer about what he knew. It was about who he was and why he had chosen to act. And in his office, Daniel read her message almost immediately, his eyes narrowing slightly as he leaned back in his chair once more, the question lingering in the air around him as if it had been spoken aloud. And for a moment, he did not answer, not because he did not want to, but because he was not entirely sure how to put the truth into words, because the real answer was not simple. It was not something that could be explained in a single sentence. It was a mixture of memory, instinct, and something deeper that he had spent years ignoring. And as he looked out over the city again, his reflection faintly visible in the glass, he found himself thinking back to a time long before the penthouse, before the company, before the decisions that defined his current life, to a version of himself that had once understood what it meant to struggle, to need help and not receive it. And the memory was distant but not gone, buried beneath years of success but still present in moments like this. And after a long pause, he picked up his phone again, his fingers moving slowly, deliberately, because once someone did not help when it mattered, he typed, stopping briefly before adding, "And I told myself I would not be that person again." And when he sent the message, he exhaled quietly, as if releasing something he had not realized he was holding on to. While in her small apartment, Emily read the words carefully, her eyes lingering on each part of the sentence as she tried to understand not just what he was saying, but what it meant beneath the surface. And as the meaning settled in, her expression softened, the earlier uncertainty replaced by something deeper, something that felt closer to understanding, because his answer was not about money, it was not about generosity, it was about choice, about a decision shaped by something he had experienced himself, and that made his actions feel different, more real, more human. And as she looked down at her phone again, her fingers resting lightly against the screen, she realized that this conversation was no longer just about help. It was about connection, fragile and unexpected, but real enough to change the way she saw the world, even if only a little. And as the rain outside finally faded into silence, the quiet between them no longer felt empty. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them had planned, but both were beginning to understand. Emily did not reply immediately, her eyes lingering on the last message as if the words carried more weight than they appeared to at first glance, because there was something in the way he said it that felt different from anything she had heard before, not dramatic, not overly emotional, but steady and quiet, like a truth that had been lived rather than explained. And she found herself leaning back slightly, her gaze drifting toward the ceiling as she let the meaning settle in, because his answer was not about her, not really. It was about him, about a moment in his past that had shaped the way he chose to act now. And that realization softened something inside her, something that had been guarded for longer than she could remember. And for the first time since this unexpected conversation had begun, She felt a sense of calm that did not come from relief alone, but from understanding, and after a few seconds, she looked back down at her phone, her fingers moving slowly as she typed, "I am glad you are not that person," and she paused, her lips pressing together briefly before she added, "Because tonight, it mattered." And when she sent the message, she set the phone down beside her, not expecting an immediate reply, because the conversation had already gone further than she could have imagined when she first pressed send on that original message, and for a moment, she allowed herself to sit in the quiet, the soft rhythm of Lily's breathing filling the room as she closed her eyes briefly, letting the exhaustion of the day catch up with her now that the urgency had passed. But across the city, Daniel read her message almost instantly, his gaze steady as the words settled in, and for a brief moment, he did not move, did not respond, because something about her reply stayed with him in a way that was difficult to ignore. It was simple, but it carried a sincerity that felt rare, unfiltered by expectation or obligation. And as he leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting once again to the city lights beyond the glass, he realized that this interaction, this small exchange that had begun by accident, had already shifted something in his night, pulling him out of the routine that usually defined his evenings. And without fully deciding to, he picked up his phone again, his fingers moving. With a quiet certainty, "What is your name?" he typed, then hesitated for just a fraction of a second before sending it, because until now, they had remained strangers in the most literal sense, connected only by circumstance and a shared moment of need. But something about the way she had spoken, the way she had trusted him enough to continue the conversation, made him feel that it was time to close that distance, even if only slightly. And in her apartment, Emily heard the soft vibration of her phone and reached for it instinctively, her eyes scanning the message as a small, almost surprised breath escaped her, because she had not realized until that moment that he did not know her name, that everything they had shared so far had existed without that basic piece of identity. And for a second, she hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen as a familiar instinct returned, the instinct to protect herself, to keep a certain distance, because names made things real, names made connections harder to walk away from. But then her gaze shifted to Lily, still sleeping peacefully in her crib, and the memory of what had just happened, of the help she had received without question, settled quietly in her chest, and she realized that holding back now felt unnecessary. So she typed, "Emily," and after a brief pause, she added, "Emily Carter," before sending it, her heart beating just a little faster than before, not out of fear, but out of the awareness that this conversation had crossed another invisible line. And as she placed the phone down again, she found herself wondering what his name might be, what kind of person he was beyond the few messages they had exchanged, and as if the thought had been heard, her phone buzzed again moments later, and when she looked at the screen, she saw his reply, simple and direct, "Daniel," and beneath it, another message followed, "Daniel Hayes." And for a moment, she simply stared at the name, letting it settle in her mind, repeating it silently, as if trying to attach it to the image she had begun to form of him. And there was something about it that felt solid, grounded, a name that matched the tone of his words, and she found herself smiling slightly, a small, unguarded expression that appeared without effort, and she typed back, "Nice to meet you, Daniel." And after a second, she added, "Even if it was by accident." And when she sent the message, she leaned back into the couch, her body finally relaxing as the tension that had defined her entire evening slowly began to fade, replaced by something quieter, something that felt almost unfamiliar in its steadiness. And across the city, Daniel read her message with a faint shift in his expression, not quite a smile, but something close to it, something that softened the edges of his usual composure. And as he looked at her words, he realized that for the first time in a long while, he was not thinking about the next deal, the next decision, the next step in a carefully structured life. He was simply present in a moment that had no agenda, no expectation, just a conversation that had unfolded in its own unexpected way. And as he placed his phone down once more, his gaze lifting toward the city that now seemed quieter than before, he found himself thinking not about how this would end, but about what it might become. And in a small apartment across town, Emily closed her eyes briefly, the soft sound of her daughter's breathing steady and reassuring. And for the first time in days, she allowed herself to feel something beyond survival, something that did not come from necessity or pressure, but from the simple fact that somewhere out there, someone had chosen to care, and that choice, however small it seemed, had already begun to change the way she saw the world around her. The night settled into a quiet stillness that felt unfamiliar in its gentleness. And for the first time in what seemed like weeks, Emily did not fall asleep from exhaustion, but from a sense of relief that wrapped around her like a soft blanket, her breathing slowing as she leaned back against the couch, her phone resting loosely in her hand while Lily slept peacefully nearby, her tiny fingers curled softly against the edge of her blanket. And somewhere between the fading sound of rain and the warmth of knowing her baby would not wake up hungry, Emily drifted into a light sleep, the kind that came without tension, without the constant weight of worry pressing against her chest. And across the city, Daniel remained awake, the lights in his office still on as the hours moved quietly past midnight. His usual routine of late-night work interrupted not by urgency, but by a lingering sense of distraction that he could not quite shake. Because even as he tried to focus on the documents in front of him, his thoughts kept returning to the conversation, to the way it had unfolded so naturally despite its unlikely beginning, and to the name that now carried more presence than it should have, Emily Carter. And he found himself picking up his phone again, not out of necessity, but out of something quieter, something closer to curiosity than intention, and he stared at the screen for a moment before typing, "You should try to rest. Tomorrow will come quickly." And after a brief pause, he added, "Take care of yourself too," before sending the message, knowing that she might already be asleep, but sending it anyway, because it felt right. And as he placed the phone down, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze lifting to the reflection of the city in the glass. But this time, the view did not feel distant or disconnected. It felt closer, as if for the first time in a long while, he was not standing above it, but within it, connected to something small but real. And eventually, even he allowed the night to pull him away from his desk, the office lights dimming as he left, the quiet echo of his footsteps fading into the stillness of the empty building. And morning arrived gently, the soft light of early sun filtering through the thin curtains of Emily's apartment, casting a pale glow across the room as the day began without urgency. And for a moment, everything felt still, until the faint sound of Lily's stirring broke the silence, her soft whimper pulling Emily from sleep, her eyes opening slowly as she adjusted to the light. And for a brief second, she felt disoriented, as if unsure whether the previous night had been real or something imagined. But then her gaze shifted to the small table beside her, where two unopened tins of formula sat, quietly, and the memory returned all at once, grounding her in the reality of what had happened. And she sat up slowly, running a hand through her hair as she reached for Lily, lifting her gently from the crib and holding her close, the familiar warmth bringing an immediate sense of purpose back into her morning. But this time, it was not accompanied by panic or stress. It was steady, manageable, and as she prepared a bottle, moving through the small kitchen space with a calm she had not felt in days, her phone buzzed softly on the table, and she glanced at it briefly, recognizing the name that now felt less like that of a stranger, Daniel, and she wiped her hands lightly before picking it up, her eyes scanning the message he had sent hours earlier. And something about it made her pause, not because of the words themselves, but because of the timing, the fact that he had thought to send it even without expecting a reply. And she felt a small, quiet smile form as she typed back, "Good morning. Thank you. I think we both managed to rest." And after a moment, she added, "Lily slept well," before sending it, her tone lighter than it had been the night before, carrying a sense of normalcy that had not been present before this unexpected connection. And as she fed Lily, sitting by the window where the morning light fell softly across the room, she found herself glancing at her phone again, not out of worry, but out of a subtle anticipation she did not fully recognize yet. And across the city, Daniel was already awake, his morning beginning earlier than most, as it always did. But today, there was a difference in the rhythm, a slight shift in his focus as he checked his phone before anything else. And when he saw her message, his expression softened just enough to notice, his reply coming more quickly than he might have expected. "Good morning, Emily. I am glad to hear that." And after a brief pause, he added, "That is what matters most." And as he sent the message, he stood by the window of his apartment now, the city stretching out below him in the clear light of day. But his thoughts were not on the skyline or the schedule waiting ahead. They were on a small apartment somewhere in that city, where a mother was starting her day without fear for the first time in a while. And as the morning continued, both of them moved through their routines, separate lives unfolding in parallel, but connected now by something subtle and unspoken, something that neither of them had planned, but both were beginning to carry with them, not as a burden, but as a quiet presence that made the day feel just a little different than before. The morning moved forward with a quiet rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar in its steadiness, and as sunlight stretched across the small apartment floor, Emily found herself doing something she had not done in a long time, moving without rushing, without constantly checking the clock as if time itself were working against her. And Lily rested calmly in her arms after finishing her bottle, her tiny fingers wrapping loosely around Emily's shirt as if holding onto something secure, something certain. And that simple feeling stayed with Emily as she walked slowly toward the window, looking out at the street below where people moved through their routines, unaware of how much a single night could change. And for a moment, she allowed herself to just stand there, holding her daughter, breathing in the stillness that no longer felt heavy, but gentle. And her phone, resting on the table behind her, buzzed again, the sound soft but noticeable in the quiet space, and she turned slightly, glancing at it before walking back and picking it up, her eyes immediately finding Daniel's name. And something about that alone felt different now, no longer unfamiliar, no longer distant, but connected to a sense of calm she had not expected. And she opened the message, reading it carefully. "Do you have work today?" And she paused for a second, considering the question, because it felt simple on the surface, but it carried an awareness that surprised her, as if he was not just making conversation, but trying to understand her day, her reality. And she shifted Lily gently onto her shoulder before replying, "I usually do, but I am between shifts right now. Casual work is not always predictable." And she hesitated before adding, "I pick up hours where I can." And after sending it, she sat down slowly, adjusting Lily in her lap as she watched her daughter's eyes begin to drift closed again. And across the city, Daniel read her reply as he stepped into the back seat of a waiting car, the quiet hum of the engine starting as the driver pulled into traffic. And his schedule for the day was already planned down to the minute: meetings, calls, decisions that required his attention. But as he read her message, something in his expression shifted slightly, a subtle narrowing of focus that had nothing to do with the work ahead. And he typed back almost immediately, "That sounds difficult to manage." And after a brief pause, he added, "What kind of work do you do?" And as he sent the message, he looked out the window at the passing streets, the city already alive with movement. But his thoughts were no longer entirely on the day ahead. They were on a different kind of detail, one that did not appear in reports or numbers, but in the way someone described their life. And in her apartment, Emily read his message as she gently placed Lily back into the crib, her movements careful and quiet. And she stood there for a moment, watching her daughter settle into sleep again before turning back to her phone, her fingers moving with more ease now than before. "Mostly hospitality," she replied. "Cafes, sometimes cleaning shifts, whatever is available." And she paused, her expression thoughtful before adding, "It is not steady, but it is enough to keep going." And when she sent the message, she leaned lightly against the wall beside the crib, her eyes drifting once more to Lily. And for a moment, she felt that familiar sense of determination rise again, the quiet strength that had carried her through months of uncertainty. But this time, it was not accompanied by the same weight. It felt lighter, steadier, as if something had shifted just enough to make the path ahead feel less overwhelming. And across the city, Daniel read her words slowly, his gaze steady as he processed the simplicity of her statement, because there was no complaint in it, no self-pity, just a clear acknowledgement of her reality. And that, more than anything else, held his attention, and he leaned slightly forward in his seat, his phone still in his hand as he typed. It should not have to be that uncertain. And then paused, his thumb hovering for a moment before continuing. "Would you consider something more stable if the opportunity came up?" And as he sent the message, he did not fully examine why he was asking. only that the thought had formed naturally, almost instinctively. And in her apartment, Emily read the question carefully, her eyes moving over the words more than once, because it was not a casual question. It carried implication, possibility, and for a moment, she felt that flicker of caution return, the instinct to question where this was leading. But alongside it was something else, something quieter but just as strong, curiosity, and she pushed herself away from the wall, walking slowly back toward the couch as she typed her reply. "Of course I would," she wrote, her tone honest but measured. "Anyone would." And after a brief pause, she added, "But those opportunities do not come easily." And when she sent the message, she sat down, her phone resting loosely in her hand as she looked around the small apartment, at the worn furniture, the simple space that had become her entire world, and for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine something different, not in a distant, unrealistic way, but in a quiet, grounded sense of possibility. And across the city, Daniel read her response. As the car slowed at a set of lights, the morning sun reflecting off the glass buildings around him, and he exhaled slowly, his gaze steady as a thought began to take shape, clearer now than before, not just a passing idea, but something more intentional. And as the car moved forward again, he typed a new message, his words measured but direct. "Then perhaps it is time one does." And as he sent it, he leaned back slightly, his eyes returning to the city ahead. But this time, his focus had shifted, because what had started as a simple response to a wrong message was no longer just a moment of kindness. It was becoming something more defined, something that carried direction. And in a small apartment across the city, Emily felt her phone vibrate once more. And as she read his message, her breath caught just slightly, not in fear, but in the quiet recognition that whatever this was, whatever had begun the night before, it was not ending here. It was only just beginning to unfold. Emily read the message more than once, her fingers tightening slightly around the phone as she tried to understand what he meant, because the words were simple, almost casual, and yet they carried a weight that did not match their tone. And for a moment, she did not respond, her eyes drifting away from the screen as she looked around her apartment again. But this time, she saw it differently, not just as a place she lived, but as a space defined by limitation, by compromise, by survival, and the thought of something beyond it, something more stable, more certain, felt both unfamiliar and dangerously hopeful. And she let out a slow breath, her hand moving to rest lightly against the back of the couch as she steadied herself. Because hope, she had learned, could be just as overwhelming as fear. And after a few seconds, she looked back down at her phone, her fingers moving slowly as she typed. "What do you mean?" And she paused before adding, "I am not sure I understand." And when she sent the message, she sat down again, her posture slightly tense now, as if bracing for something she could not yet see. And across the city, Daniel read her reply as he stepped out of the car, the glass doors of a tall office building sliding open in front of him as he moved inside, his surroundings shifting into the polished, controlled environment that had defined his daily life for years. But even as people greeted him, and the rhythm of business resumed around him, his attention remained on the message in his hand, and he slowed his pace slightly, his gaze steady as he considered how to respond. Because this moment, unlike the ones before it, required more than instinct. It required clarity, and he knew that whatever he said next would shape the direction of everything that followed. And after a brief pause, he typed, "I mean that if you are willing, I would like to help you find something more stable." And he hesitated before continuing. "A proper role, consistent hours, something you can rely on." And as he sent the message, he continued walking, his expression composed, but his thoughts more focused than usual. Because this was no longer just a response, it was a decision. And in her apartment, Emily felt her phone vibrate again, her breath catching slightly as she read the message, her eyes moving slowly across each word. And for a moment, everything seemed to quiet around her, the small sounds of the room fading as her mind tried to process what he was offering. Because this was not a small gesture, not like the money, not like the messages. This was something larger, something that could change the structure of her life in a way she had not allowed herself to imagine. And her first instinct was disbelief, followed quickly by caution, because offers like that did not come without reasons, without expectations. and she sat very still, her fingers resting lightly against the phone as she thought carefully about what to say, because this was the moment where she needed to be clear, not just about what he was offering, but about what she was willing to accept. And after a few seconds, she began to type, her words measured, deliberate. "That is very kind of you, Daniel," she wrote, and paused, her expression serious now. "But I do not understand why you would do that for someone you do not know." And she stared at the message for a moment before sending it, her heart beating just a little faster as she waited, because this question mattered more than any of the ones before it. It was no longer about curiosity, it was about trust. And across the city, Daniel reached his office and closed the door behind him, the noise of the outside world fading into a controlled silence as he sat down at his desk, his phone still in his hand as her message appeared on the screen, and he read it slowly, his gaze steady, because he had expected this, expected the hesitation, the need for explanation, and he leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the desk as he considered his answer, because the truth, once again, was not simple, it was not something that could be reduced to a single reason, and yet, he understood that simplicity was what she needed, clarity without confusion, intention without ambiguity, and after a moment, he typed, "You are right to ask that," and paused briefly before continuing. "I do not make offers like this lightly." And his expression shifted slightly as he added, "But I believe that sometimes the right thing to do is not about how well you know someone, but about recognizing when someone deserves a chance." And as he sent the message, he exhaled slowly, his gaze lifting toward the window behind his desk, the city stretching out below him in sharp lines and movement. But his thoughts were not on the view. They were on the quiet space of a small apartment where his words were now being read. And in that apartment, Emily felt something shift as she took in his response, her eyes lingering on the phrase, "deserves a chance." And she lowered her phone slightly, her gaze unfocused for a moment, as the words settled into something deeper than she had expected, because no one had said that to her in a long time. No one had framed her situation as something worthy of opportunity rather than something to be endured, and that alone made her pause, her defenses softening just enough to let the possibility in, and she looked down at her phone again, her fingers moving more slowly now, less guarded. "And what would that chance look like?" she typed, her tone still careful, but no longer distant. And when she sent the message, she leaned back into the couch, her eyes drifting briefly toward Lily, who continued to sleep peacefully, unaware of the quiet turning point unfolding around her and across the city. Daniel read the message and allowed himself a brief pause, because this was the moment where possibility began to take shape, not as an idea, but as something real, something that could be acted upon. And as he began to type his reply, his movements were steady, deliberate, guided not by impulse, but by a decision that had already been made, a decision that would carry both of them forward into something neither of them had planned, but both were now beginning to step into, one message at a time. Daniel did not respond immediately, and for the first time since their conversation had begun, the pause felt intentional, not uncertain, as if he was choosing his words with more care than before. And in his office, the quiet hum of the air conditioning filled the space while the city moved far below, but his attention remained fixed on the message in front of him, because her question had shifted everything from possibility into expectation, and he understood that whatever he said next needed to be real, not vague, not something that would fade once the moment passed. And he leaned slightly forward, resting his arms on the desk as he began to type, his movements slow but deliberate. "It would look like a proper position in one of my companies," he wrote, pausing briefly before continuing. "Something administrative to begin with, steady hours, fair pay, and room to grow if you want it." And as he read the words back to himself, he knew they were clear enough, grounded in reality, rather than promise. And he sent the message, setting his phone down for a moment as if giving the words space to land. While across the city, Emily felt her breath catch as she read his reply, her eyes widening slightly as the meaning settled in, because this was no longer abstract, no longer just an idea. It was a concrete offer, structured, defined, something she could picture in her mind, and she sat very still, her phone held tightly in both hands as she tried to process it, her thoughts moving quickly now, faster than she could fully control, because this was the kind of opportunity she had imagined in quiet moments but never expected to be offered, especially not like this, not from someone she had met through a mistake. And yet, the clarity of his words made it feel real, made it harder to dismiss, and she stood slowly, almost without thinking, walking toward the small kitchen as if movement might help her think more clearly. But the space around her felt different now, smaller somehow, more temporary, and she leaned lightly against the counter, her gaze unfocused as she tried to ground herself in something familiar, something certain, and after a few seconds, she looked back down at her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen before she began to type. "You said one of your companies," she wrote, her tone careful but direct. "What do you mean by that?" And when she sent the message, she felt a flicker of hesitation again, not because she doubted him, but because the scale of what he was offering was beginning to take shape in a way she could not ignore. And in his office, Daniel read her reply with a slight shift in his expression, something between acknowledgement and expectation, because this was the question that moved everything into the open, the one that would define how much he was willing to reveal. And for a moment, he considered keeping it simple, avoiding specifics, but he knew that would not work. Not now. Not when she had already shown a willingness to question and understand. And he leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting briefly to the city outside before returning to his phone, his fingers moving with a quiet certainty. "I run Hayes Group," he typed, pausing for just a fraction of a second before adding. "It includes several businesses across different sectors." And as he read the message, he knew it was straightforward, factual, but he also knew that it carried weight, because it revealed more about his world than anything he had said so far. And when he sent it, he exhaled slowly, as if acknowledging that the distance between them had shifted again. While in her apartment, Emily read the message and felt the room seem to quiet around her, her eyes lingering on the name as her mind tried to place it, because it sounded familiar, not in a personal way, but in the way certain names existed in the background of everyday life, mentioned in passing, seen in headlines, associated with things that felt far removed from her own reality. And she moved slowly back toward the couch, sitting down as she read the message again, her heartbeat steady but more noticeable now. And she reached for her phone again, her fingers moving with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "I think I have heard of that," she typed, then paused before adding, "That is a large company." And when she sent the message, she leaned back, slightly, her gaze drifting once more toward Lily, who continued to sleep peacefully, untouched by the shift happening around her. And in that moment, Emily felt the full weight of the contrast between their worlds, between the life she had been living and the one he was describing. And it was not intimidating in the way she might have expected, but grounding, because it made her realize just how far this opportunity could reach. And across the city, Daniel read her message with a quiet understanding, because he could sense the shift in her perception, the way she was beginning to connect the pieces, and he did not rush to clarify further, did not try to minimize or exaggerate what he had said. Instead, he replied simply, "It is established, yes." And after a brief pause, he added, "Which means I can offer something stable." And as he sent the message, he leaned back once more, his gaze steady as he allowed the conversation to settle, because this was no longer about convincing her. It was about giving her the space to decide. And in her apartment, Emily stared at the screen for a long moment, her thoughts quieter now, more focused, because the situation had become clear in a way that left little room for doubt. And as she looked around her apartment one more time, taking in the worn edges of the life she had built through necessity, she felt something shift inside her, not a sudden leap of faith, but a steady recognition of possibility. And as she picked up her phone again, her fingers moved with more certainty than before. "If I say yes," she typed, her tone calm but firm, "what happens next?" And when she sent the message, she sat still, her gaze steady as she waited. Because this was no longer just a conversation, it was a turning point, and whatever came next would begin to shape everything that followed. Daniel read her message without moving for several seconds, his gaze fixed on the words as if they carried more than a simple question. Because this was the moment where possibility turned into action, where intention required structure, and he understood that what he said next would not just influence her decision, it would define how real this opportunity felt. And he leaned slightly forward in his chair, resting his hands against the desk as he began to think through the steps, not in the abstract way he approached business decisions, but in a way that considered her reality, her situation, and the gap between where she was and where this could take her. And after a quiet pause, he picked up his phone and began to type, his movements steady, deliberate. "If you say yes, we start with something simple," he wrote, pausing briefly before continuing. "I will arrange for you to meet with someone from my team. They will go through your experience, your skills, and help place you in a role that fits." And he read the message once, then added, "No pressure, no obligation. You decide if it feels right." And when he sent it, he leaned back slightly, his expression calm but focused, because he knew that clarity mattered more than persuasion. And across the city, Emily felt her breath slow as she read his reply, her eyes moving carefully across each line, because there was something reassuring in the way he framed it, not as a demand, not as something she owed him, but as an option, a step she could take without losing control. And she sat quietly for a moment, her phone resting in her hands as she processed what he had said, her thoughts no longer racing, but moving steadily, grounded in the reality of what was being offered. And she looked around her apartment again, at the small details that defined her daily life, the narrow space, the worn furniture, the quiet signs of a life built through necessity. And for the first time, she did not feel trapped by it. She felt ready to move beyond it. And her gaze shifted to Lily, who was beginning to stir again, her small movements gentle as she woke. And Emily stood slowly, walking over to the crib and lifting her daughter into her arms, holding her close as she felt that familiar sense of responsibility settle into place. But this time, it was accompanied by something new, something steadier, and she looked down at her phone again, her fingers moving with quiet certainty as she typed. "That sounds fair," she wrote, her tone calm but thoughtful, and after a brief pause, she added, "I would like to try." And when she sent the message, she felt a subtle shift inside her, not a dramatic change, but a quiet decision taking form. And across the city, Daniel read her reply as a faint expression of acknowledgement crossed his face. Not surprise, not satisfaction, but something closer to respect, because he understood what it meant for her to say yes, not just to the opportunity, but to the uncertainty that came with it. And he picked up his phone again, his response coming more quickly now. "Good," he typed, and after a brief pause, he added, "Then we take the next step today." And as he sent the message, he turned slightly in his chair, pressing a button on his desk phone, his tone shifting into something more formal as he spoke to his assistant, arranging the details with quiet efficiency. But even as he did, his attention remained partly on the conversation, because this was not just another task to be delegated, it was something more personal, something that had begun outside the structure of his usual world. And in her apartment, Emily read his message and felt a small sense of anticipation rise, her fingers adjusting slightly around Lily as she walked toward the window, the morning light now brighter, filling the room with a warmth that felt different from the night before. And she typed back, "What do I need to do?" her tone steady, ready, and when she sent it, she found herself standing a little straighter, her posture reflecting the shift she felt internally. And across the city, Daniel read her message and allowed himself a brief pause before responding, because this was where simplicity mattered most. And he typed, "I will send you a contact number and an address," he wrote, then added, "They will expect you this afternoon." And after a brief moment, he included, "Just bring yourself. That is enough." And as he sent the message, he leaned back once more, his gaze lifting toward the window as he allowed the process to begin unfolding. And in her apartment, Emily felt her heart beat just a little faster as she read his words, her mind already beginning to adjust to the idea of stepping into something new, something unfamiliar. And she looked down at Lily, who blinked up at her with soft, curious eyes. And for a moment, everything felt clear, not easy, but clear. And she smiled faintly, a quiet expression of determination forming as she typed her final reply for now. "Thank you, Daniel," she wrote, her tone sincere, grounded, and after a brief pause, she added, "I will be there." And when she sent the message, she lowered her phone slowly, her gaze lifting toward the window once more, the city outside moving as it always did, unaware of the quiet shift that had just taken place inside a small apartment, where a single decision had begun to open a path that did not exist the day before, and for the first time in a long time, Emily did not feel like she was simply moving through her life. She felt like she was stepping into it. The address arrived a few seconds later, simple and precise, along with a contact name and a time. And as Emily read it, she felt the reality of what she had agreed to settle fully into place, not as a distant idea, but as something immediate, something that would begin in just a few hours. And for a moment, she stood still in the middle of her apartment, Lily resting quietly against her shoulder, the soft warmth of her daughter grounding her in a way nothing else could, and she closed her eyes. Briefly, taking a slow breath as she let the weight of the decision move through her, not resisting it, not overthinking it, just allowing herself to accept that this was happening. And when she opened her eyes again, there was a quiet focus in them that had not been there before, something steady and intentional, and she moved with purpose, setting Lily gently into her stroller and beginning to prepare for the afternoon. Her actions simple but deliberate as she chose her clothes carefully, something clean, modest, and presentable, even if worn, smoothing the fabric with her hands as if small details might somehow reflect the seriousness of the opportunity she was stepping into. And the apartment, though unchanged, felt different as she moved through it, not because it had become less familiar, but because she was no longer looking at it as her only world. And outside, the city carried on as it always did, the midday sun casting sharp light across the streets as people moved quickly between places, unaware of the quiet shift happening in one small life among thousands. And as Emily stepped out of her building, pushing the stroller carefully along the footpath, she felt a mixture of emotions rise within her, not fear exactly, but awareness, the kind that comes when something matters, when the outcome is uncertain but significant. And she adjusted her grip slightly, her posture steady as she made her way toward the bus stop, the movement grounding her in something practical, something she could control. And across the city, Daniel glanced briefly at his phone between meetings, his expression unchanged but his attention sharpening slightly as he noted the time. Because even as his day unfolded with its usual demands, part of his focus remained on the arrangement he had set in motion, not with concern, but with a quiet sense of responsibility, and he trusted the process he had created, the people he had assigned. But this felt different, more personal, and he did not dwell on it, simply acknowledging it before returning to the discussion in front of him. And back on the street, Emily boarded the bus with careful movements, lifting the stroller with the help of a kind stranger who offered a brief nod and a small smile, and she thanked him softly, her voice steady as she moved into a seat near the window, her gaze drifting outside as the bus pulled away, the city passing by in a blur of familiar sights. But today, they felt slightly altered, as if she were seeing them from a different perspective, one that included possibility where there had once only been routine. And she checked the address again, confirming the location, her fingers brushing lightly against the screen as if the words themselves held significance. And when the bus reached her stop, she stepped off carefully, her eyes lifting to take in the building in front of her, tall and polished, its glass exterior reflecting the sky in sharp clarity. And for a moment, she paused, her breath catching slightly as the contrast between her world and this one became visible in a way she could not ignore. But she did not turn away. She adjusted her hold on the stroller and moved forward, each step deliberate, grounded in the quiet decision she had already made. And inside, the lobby was bright and open, the air cool and controlled as people moved with purpose, their voices low, their movements efficient. And Emily felt the difference immediately, the shift in atmosphere, in expectation. But she held her posture steady, her focus clear as she approached the reception desk, her voice calm as she gave her name. And the receptionist glanced at the screen before offering a polite nod, directing her toward a waiting area with a simple gesture. And as Emily moved to sit, her hands resting lightly on the stroller handle, she took a slow breath, her eyes scanning the space around her, not with intimidation, but with quiet observation. And somewhere above, in an office that overlooked the same city, Daniel stood by the window for a brief moment between meetings, his gaze distant as he allowed himself a single thought, that sometimes the smallest decisions carried the greatest impact. And then he turned away, returning to the rhythm of his day, While below, in the quiet waiting area, Emily sat still, her presence calm but resolute, as the next part of her life began to unfold not with certainty, but with something just as powerful, a chance she had chosen to take. Emily sat quietly in the waiting area, her hands resting lightly on the stroller as the steady hum of the building surrounded her, a soft blend of distant conversations, footsteps across polished floors, and the faint sound of elevators moving between levels. And for a moment, she simply observed, her eyes moving across the space with a calm attentiveness that masked the quiet tension beneath it, because everything here felt different from what she was used to, not just the environment, but the rhythm, the expectation, the sense that every movement had purpose. And she adjusted her posture slightly, sitting a little straighter as Lily shifted gently in the stroller, her small movements grounding Emily in something familiar, something that reminded her why she was here. And as the minutes passed, she found her breathing settling into a steady rhythm, her thoughts no longer racing but focused, anchored in the decision she had already made. And when her name was called, her attention shifted immediately, her gaze lifting as a woman in a neat, professional outfit approached with a polite smile, introducing herself as Claire, her voice calm and measured as she gestured for Emily to follow. And Emily stood carefully, her hands steady as she guided the stroller beside her, her steps deliberate as she moved through the corridor, the space around her opening into offices and meeting rooms that reflected a level of order and precision she had rarely experienced firsthand. And as they entered a small meeting room with a large window overlooking the city, Emily felt a subtle shift in her awareness, not intimidation, but recognition of where she was, of the opportunity unfolding in front of her. And Claire motioned for her to sit, her tone warm but professional as she began to speak, explaining the process, the role they had in mind, and how the company operated, her words clear and structured in a way that made everything feel organized, manageable. And Emily listened carefully, her attention focused as she absorbed each detail, her responses thoughtful and measured when asked about her experience, her skills, her background, and she spoke honestly, not embellishing, not minimizing, simply stating what she had done, what she could do, and what she was willing to learn. And as the conversation continued, something began to shift, not just in how she was being evaluated, but in how she saw herself within that space. Because for the first time, she was not being judged by her circumstances, but by her potential. And that realization settled quietly but firmly within her, giving her a sense of steadiness she had not expected. And Claire nodded occasionally, taking notes, her expression attentive but encouraging. And when the discussion turned to logistics, to hours, to responsibilities, Emily found herself answering without hesitation, her voice steady as she confirmed her availability, her willingness to adapt, and her understanding of what would be required. And throughout it all, Lily remained calm, occasionally shifting in the stroller but otherwise content, her presence a quiet reminder of everything that mattered. And as the meeting drew to a close, Claire offered a small, reassuring smile, explaining that while formalities would take a short time to finalize, the intention was clear, the position was available, and if Emily was comfortable, they could begin the process immediately. And for a moment, Emily simply sat there, her hands resting lightly on the stroller handle as she let the words settle in, because this was the confirmation, the point where possibility became reality. And she nodded slowly, her expression calm but her eyes reflecting something deeper, something close to relief. And she thanked Claire sincerely, her voice steady as she stood, preparing to leave. And as she walked back through the corridor, the same path she had entered moments before now felt different, not because the environment had changed, but because her place within it had shifted. And when she stepped back into the lobby, the light from the large windows seemed brighter, the space more open, and she paused briefly, her gaze lifting toward the upper floors of the building, not knowing exactly where Daniel might be, but aware of his presence in a way that felt grounded rather than distant. And outside, the air felt warmer as she stepped onto the street, the sounds of the city wrapping around her once again, but this time, they did not feel overwhelming. They felt familiar, manageable, part of a world she was beginning to navigate in a new way. And as she walked toward the bus stop, her phone resting quietly in her hand, she allowed herself a small moment, a quiet acknowledgement of what had just happened, not as something extraordinary, but as something earned, something she had stepped into with intention. And across the city, Daniel glanced briefly at his phone between meetings, seeing a new message appear, and when he opened it, he read Emily's words, simple and direct. "I think it went well." And for a moment, he allowed himself a small pause. His expression unchanged, but his focus sharpened, and he typed back, "I expected it would." His response measured but certain, and as he sent it, he returned his attention to the work in front of him, not because the moment was unimportant, but because it had already achieved what it needed to. And in that quiet exchange, both of them understood something without needing to say it, that a single decision, made in an unexpected moment, had begun to change the direction of a life, not through chance alone, but through the willingness to act when it mattered most. The afternoon light stretched long across the street as Emily stepped off the bus, her movements slower now, not from exhaustion but from the quiet weight of everything that had just unfolded, and she paused for a moment on the pavement, her hand resting lightly on the stroller as she looked ahead toward her building. The familiar structure standing exactly as it had that morning, unchanged in every visible way. And yet something within her had shifted so deeply that even the simplest surroundings felt different, as if the space she was returning to no longer defined the limits of her life. And she exhaled slowly, a breath that carried both relief and disbelief, before guiding the stroller forward, her steps steady, her posture grounded in something new, something that had not existed just hours before. And as she entered her apartment, the quiet greeted her in the same gentle way. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the filtered light through the curtains, the small details of a life built carefully and patiently. And she moved through it with a sense of awareness that felt sharper, more present, setting the stroller beside the couch before lifting Lily into her arms, holding her close for a moment longer than usual, her cheek resting lightly against her daughter's soft hair. Because everything she had done, every decision she had made, had always come back to this, to the simple need to protect and provide. And now, for the first time in a long time, she felt that responsibility met with something other than uncertainty, and she walked slowly to the window, looking out at the city as it moved through the late afternoon, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. And for a moment, she saw herself differently, not as someone trying to keep up, trying to hold everything together, but as someone who had taken a step forward, someone who had chosen to move rather than remain still. And her phone, resting in her hand, felt heavier now, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented, and she looked down at it, her fingers brushing lightly across the screen as she opened the message thread, her gaze settling on Daniel's last reply, simple, certain, and she hesitated for a moment before typing, her words slower now, more thoughtful. "They said I can start soon," she wrote, her tone calm but steady, and after a brief pause, she added, "I wanted to say thank you properly." And she stared at the message for a second before sending it, her breath catching just slightly as she did, because this was not just gratitude, it was acknowledgement. And across the city, Daniel stood in his office as the day began to wind down, the sharp lines of business softening into the quieter rhythm of evening. And when his phone vibrated, he glanced at it without urgency, but when he saw her name, his attention sharpened just enough to pause, and he read her message once, then again, his expression thoughtful, not surprised, but aware of the significance behind her words. And he walked slowly toward the window, the city stretching out beneath him in fading light. And for a moment, he did not respond, not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood that some moments did not require elaborate answers. They required clarity, and he typed slowly, deliberately, "You do not owe me anything, Emily," and paused before adding, "You made the decision to step forward. That is what matters." And when he sent the message, he remained still for a moment, his gaze resting on the horizon. And in her apartment, Emily read his words carefully, her eyes lingering on each line as if searching for something more. But what she found instead was something simpler, something steady, and she felt a small, quiet smile form, not because everything had suddenly become easy, but because for the first time, she did not feel alone in facing what came next. And she looked down at Lily, who had begun to stir again, her small eyes opening slowly as she blinked up at her mother, unaware of the shift that had taken place. and Emily adjusted her hold gently, her voice soft as she whispered something only Lily could hear, something simple, something warm, and as the evening settled in, the light outside fading into the soft glow of street lamps, the city continued its endless motion. But inside one small apartment, a different kind of movement had begun, one that did not rely on urgency or fear, but on choice, on the quiet strength to accept help and the courage to step into something new. And far above, in an office overlooking that same city, Daniel stood for a moment longer before turning away, his day complete, his mind already moving toward what came next. But somewhere beneath all of that, there was a quiet understanding.